Welcome to our 5-minute session. Today, we will discuss the effect of aggressive fantasy on subjective well-being. As we start, I would like to ask you a quick question. Have you ever met someone you hate so much who you would like to fight against in response? But due to social order and rule, you know you cannot injure someone physically, so you decided to start a battle in your world of imagination. In psychology, these processes of imagination are referred to as aggressive fantasy, which is a mental rehearsal of aggressive behavior unconstrained by reality. Interestingly, a survey conducted by the research team showed that around 2/3 of participants indicated that they showed such tendencies. So you might ask, why are we interested in studying aggressive fantasy when we can study aggressive behavior? Past studies showed that aggressive acts are relatively rare in our daily encounters because they could result in various undesirable costs and consequences, leading to poorer life outcomes and lower satisfactory social relationships. Thus, it is more feasible for people to fantasize about aggressive actions against a target than to inflict actual harm. Some might ask the second question: what are some known negative impacts of aggressive fantasy? Although some past studies provided evidence suggesting that aggressive fantasy is associated with actual aggression and less forgiveness, formal research on the psychological consequences of aggressive fantasy is lacking. Thus, the current experiment tested whether aggressive fantasy causes people to ruminate and negatively affects their subjective well-being. Rumination refers to the repetitive conscious concerns or goal-related thoughts that recur over time. Rumination-prone individuals often suffer from interpersonal problems and negative life outcomes, including lowered self-esteem and heightened identity distress. Additionally, subjective well-being consists of 3 essential components: higher life satisfaction, more positive affective experiences, and less negative affective experiences. The increment in repetitive and obsessive thoughts can prompt people to re-experience the unpleasant emotions associated with the undesirable events and affects one's ability to perform daily functions. Some previous findings also suggest that rumination can amplify people's negative and depressive moods, which is detrimental to their long-term well-being. We further proposed that aggressive fantasy increases rumination because people tend to dwell more on unpleasant conflicts when they fantasize aggression. This is created by people's cognition attentional biases, which cause them to ruminate after experiencing a stressful event and pay extra attention to details associated with the target. Therefore, individuals fantasizing aggression may experience more intrusive thoughts, prompting them to ruminate more regularly. Nevertheless, the present research proposed that aggressive fantasy leads to rumination, and such rumination should negatively predict their subjective well-being. We recruited 138 participants to complete the following study. First, the participants were instructed to think of a person they really hate and explain why. Then, an experimental manipulation was introduced, which is an imagination task. Participants were randomly assigned into the aggressive fantasy group or control group. Participants in the aggressive fantasy group were asked to envisage aggressive actions they would employ to harm the person they hate. In contrast, participants in the control group were asked to envisage things they would do in the upcoming week. After the task, participants' ruminative tendencies were assessed by a self-report measure. Their subjective well-being was also assessed through a satisfaction with life scale. The result from the experiment showed that participants in the aggressive fantasy group tended to report higher levels of rumination and lower levels of subjective well-being than participants in the control group. The mediation analysis also showed that rumination mediates the effect of aggressive fantasy on subjective well-being. To conclude, The current study demonstrated that aggressive fantasy decreases subjective well-being. Rumination was also an important psychological mechanism that mediates the relationship. The findings contributed to the literature by providing new insights into the psychological consequences of aggression and revealing the underlying mechanism. This is the end of our presentation, and I hope our findings provided you with some new insights. If you would like to learn more about the research, you can scan the QR code to read the full article. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.